Good morning, everyone. My name is Jeff Overmars, and I work with the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission. It's my pleasure to welcome you to one of several sessions taking place during Nova Scotia Human Rights Week. Since 2023, communities throughout the province have been invited to join in a week-long celebration of human rights from December the 3rd to the 10th. Presented by the Human Rights Commission in partnership with human rights champions, community organizations, and government, the week's events highlight the foundational role human rights play in protecting each person's right to live free from discrimination and the powerful force of a collective effort. The topic of today's presentation is Towards Transformation, an intersectional look into anti-trans rhetoric across the country. Together, we will be supported in exploring 2S LGBTQIA+ realities, discussions of current anti-trans legislation, examining tangible and interpersonal examples of allyship and solidarity through a culturally relevant, informed lens for building supportive environments and change in our communities and beyond. I'm pleased to welcome Carmel Farahbakhsh, Executive Director of the Youth Project, a nonprofit organization with a mission to make Nova Scotia a safer and happier place for 2S LGBTQIA+ youth. Before I pass the mic over to Carmel, I'd like to share that with deep respect for the Mi'kmaq people, the Commission acknowledges that we are located in Chubuktuk, on the unceded ancestral territory of Mi'kma'ki. This land is covered by the sacred peace and friendship treaties signed with the British Crown in the early 1700s. We honor the profound historical and spiritual connections of the Mi'kmaq people to this land, where their ancestors' legacies endure. As treaty people, we are bound by the promises made in these treaties, guiding us in mutual respect and recognition in reconciliation. We commit to working together with respect for the Mi'kmaq people, their culture, and their rights. Again, I want to thank everybody for tuning in for this important discussion this morning. Without further ado, over to you, Carmel.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here. I'm going to share my screen and go through a presentation with folks, but I really want you to feel and think about the content, and I really welcome discussion and conversation. While I'm sharing my screen, I won't be able to respond to things in the chat, but I really encourage folks, if you feel comfortable, to use the chat as a way to discuss things that are coming up for you, as well as use the Q&A box for questions that you might have specifically for me. So, for example, in the chat, if you want to share resources that you know about, or specific elements of work that you engage in that you feel would be important for folks to know, then I really welcome that. And I look forward to answering any questions at the end. So again, thank you for being here and having, I think, a very big conversation about gender and sexuality and self-expression across the country. And we'll do a little bit of zooming in and zooming out to talk about a provincial context, a national context, and what things that are happening in different provinces, how they possibly could impact Nova Scotia, but also how we can ensure that we are creating the most welcoming and affirming province as possible. So we don't have to necessarily respond in reactive ways to possible legislation in the future. So I'm going to share my screen. And we just had a wonderful land acknowledgement. But I want to ask folks to really think about what they feel like Nova Scotia, Halifax, Chibuktuk, may look like, act like, without the context of realities of colonization. And I think when thinking about colonization, there are so many pieces to consider, like the centering of Indigenous knowledge systems, of course, protection of land and resources, but also really challenging colonial structures of thought and ideas that have been imposed violently, not only on Indigenous populations historically, but have then affected all of us generationally. And some of those, I think, ideologies are rooted in things like the gender binary. So the idea that there are only two genders, when in our context of history, we know that in Indigenous knowledge systems, that was not the case. There is a long lineage of gender diversity within Indigenous knowledge systems across different nations in the country. And we'll talk a little bit more about different examples of that, specifically to Mi'kmaq. But just really challenging folks to think about those possibilities and use our imaginations to think about what the world could look like, act like, feel like, be like if we were, um, yeah, not in a context of colonization, not existing within that context of colonization. Two of my favorite teachers, Alexis Pauline Gumbs and Audre Lorde, I really want to use their words to open the space. So freedom is not a secret, it's a practice, thinking about the practical ways that we engage in liberation. Um, and thinking about working towards liberation or working towards freedom as something that we do every single day through tangible action, and also through the understanding that we are in discovery all the time around what freedom and what liberation can look like. And only through that discovery and curiosity and conversation can we work towards a more uh, aware, intentional, intersectional practice of fighting for freedom for all. And Audre Lorde, brilliant as always, says, "What are the words you do not yet have?" Which I think just speaks to the importance of holding curiosity in the center of this work. And I think something that is really important to think about is how our imaginations are really important tools in these conversations. Being open-minded, being open and curious, dreaming new ways the world can look and act is a cornerstone to, I think, engaging in anti-oppressive and intersectional work. I feel like that's the heartbeat of it. And you'll see throughout a bunch of different art on the slides. And these are intentional pieces of art. Some are created by young people that access our programs. Some are other really incredible established artists. But all of these artists are local to Chibuktuk, and are part of the 2S LGBTQIA plus community. And thinking about our imaginations, thinking about our creativity, I feel is directly linked to this work, as I've been saying, and so I really want also this art to inspire you. I'm also supposed to tell all of you that Evie is now not 10, is in fact 14, and is way better at art, even though I think this is incredible art. But that is what she wanted me to share, if I'm sharing her work. Awesome. So I want to just do a quick acronym review. This is an acronym that is specifically looking at the Two-Spirit trans and gender nonconforming community. So it's not the entire acronym that is usually used. And I'll be using this acronym a little bit throughout the presentation, just because there are pieces that will be directly discussing the realities of trans communities. And so we put Two Spirit at the beginning of the acronym, in acknowledgement of the ways in which colonialism has pushed or worked to push Indigenous knowledge systems away from the conversation around gender and sexuality, and also to center Indigenous knowledge systems in the conversation presently and today. And Two Spirit is a pan-Indigenous identity specific to Turtle Island, that was named or coined as Two Spirit identity in the 1990s. And this was actually at a conference where Indigenous folks from across the country were trying to find a way to describe a shared context of gender diversity within their cultural context and practice. Trans is an umbrella term, and that's probably a word that you're quite familiar with. And it can be used in a wide variety of ways to describe experiences of gender and identity. And I think the most important piece is that trans talks about an experience where you feel incongruence with the sex you were assigned at birth. But there are endless trans narratives and trans bodies, just like there are endless two-spirit narratives and two-spirit bodies. And finally, GNC or gender nonconforming, which is another umbrella term for folks who feel outside of the gender binary altogether. Um, and there are, again, many different ways that this can look and this can feel. So we use this as an umbrella term, knowing that there's a whole bunch of identities that exist under gender nonconformity. And so the most important thing when meeting someone or engaging with someone who's part of this vast community is, of course, just to mirror their language. We don't want to assign identity. We want to follow people's lead and utilize the words that they're using to self-describe. Great. May, how's my speed? Is my speed okay? Or should I slow? Okay, great. And then very quickly, just talking about pronouns. These stand in place of a person's name. There are the gendered he, she, and they pronouns, and then more neutral they, them pronouns that I think are quite common. My pronouns are they, them. And there are also neopronouns, and these are genius ways that often younger people within the community have found ways to create new pathways for the English language and the limits within the English language, which I think is very cool. And this is a way that folks can create a pronoun that has no connotation of gender because it's a new word. And being in youth work, it is a humbling experience, a learning experience. And I love learning from these incredible thinkers who are, I think, really leading the conversation around gender and identity. Neopronouns take some getting used to, but there is a resource for that. So if there's someone that you know, in your work, a young person in your life, a friend, a community member, you can go to this link here. I'll send the slides out to folks if they would like to practice neopronoun. So you can actually just input the pronoun, the neopronoun, and it can help you conjugate the pronoun and use it in day-to-day conversation. We talked also about contexts of identity and gender nonconformity specific to Mi'kmaq. So negum is a pronoun in Mi'kmaq, which directly translate to she, he, hers, his, and is a gender neutral pronoun. And so some people who are Mi'kmaq might use negum as a pronoun. And I think a few pieces about this. One, it's really important to learn as much Mi'kmaq as we can because we are settlers, or I guess in my context, I'm a settler on this territory, and so that feels important. And two, it's important to also think about language in relation to archiving ways of being and knowing that have existed much before in the context of me, right? And so hearing that there is this gender neutral pronoun in Mi'kmaq not only teaches a Mi'kmaq word, but also teaches us about a Mi'kmaq practice that predates much more than me being on this land, and much more than my family being on this land. Great. I also quickly want to go over gender affirming care and what that means. And often there is kind of this narrative that gender affirming care is a linear progression that folks start out as non-trans and then become more and more trans until they finish their transition. And I want to challenge it a little bit. I think gender affirming care is something that gender nonconforming two-spirit or trans folks can access at any point in their lives. And it's often a very fluid context of transition. A lot of people, as they learn more about themselves, may access different contexts of gender affirming care or stop at various elements of gender affirming care. And so there are the context of social transition, so coming out, changing a name or pronouns, changing how you look, like getting a haircut, changing the clothes you wear. Um, and then there is the physical, which is gender affirming gear, hormone therapy or surgery. And then legal, which is through name change, gender marker change, documentation change, all the kind of bureaucratic elements of being trans, changing your ID, all of that kind of stuff. Um, so I think something that I want to name is that there is currently a lot of misinformation in North America specifically, about what gender affirming care is, who can access it, why. And I think a lot of this misinformation is incredibly um, intentional, and the intention is to demonize accessing gender affirming care and to talk about gender affirming care as something that's dangerous to children and to youth. And while there is so much misinformation to wade through in that statement, the first is, I think, the most obvious, which is gender affirming care can be anything from a person feeling safe enough to change their name or change their identification. And actually, that has nothing to do with the physical body. But gender affirming care is also something as simple as having a care practitioner that understands and doesn't want to pathologize gender identity, and is open to supporting and listening to a young person who is experiencing maybe some new feelings, some new elements of their identity, and expressing them to caregivers or parents or practitioners or friends, right? And then there's also a lot of misinformation specifically about what gender affirming care entails and the surgical and hormone-based contexts of gender affirming care. And of course, every province is different. But in our province, accessing gender affirming care is actually quite difficult and barriered. And so part of misinformation that exists, that talks about how gender affirming care is something that's really easy to get, that kids can get it, that young youth can just walk into a doctor's office and get access to hormones or start their surgical journey. But really, it's much more complex than that. And I would even say quite barriered, to the point where some folks who really need access to care aren't receiving it in a timely way. Um, Without getting too much into all of the elements of physical transition, I will point folks to a great resource that Pride Health created. And it's on their website. And it's a great resource that goes through kind of all of these different elements of transition. So, social transition, physical transition, legal transition, or access to gender affirming care, and talks about the process. And most processes start when you are uh, an adult, or start if you have support from a parent or guardian and you are above the age of 16. Of course, there are some situations that are a case-by-case basis. Some situations where a young person may decide, with the support of their physician or parents, to engage with hormone blockers. But that is something that a young person can't decide without the support of a pretty big care team. And hormone blockers are not just something that younger trans folks use, but is actually something that a lot of people use for a variety of reasons, including really intense growth spurts. And blockers were not actually created for trans young people, but have now been used as an element of gender affirming care, if it makes sense to that young person and to their family. And what they do is halt puberty so young people can make a decision about how they feel in relationship to their body and just give them some extra time to understand kind of what the options are if they're feeling a lot of incongruence with their body, not feeling like how they feel matches the sex they were assigned at birth. There's a lot of, I think, big conversations and questions to have, and it can be really disorienting and scary for a young person who feels that discomfort and dysphoria and incongruence to be going through puberty at a pretty rapid speed. And so, what blockers do is slow down that process, halt that process, give young people some more time to think about what they need. And then, when that person has made a decision, either, yes, in my future, I would like to access gender affirming care, healthcare through the context of maybe hormone therapy, or when I'm old enough, accessing a context of surgery. It just gives them some more time, and then they can go off of the blocker if they choose. And then they will just start to experience puberty as they had left off. So if folks have any questions about that, I'm happy to answer. But a lot of these processes um, are quite medical, and are conversations that happen with medical practitioners and professionals, and a parent and guardian team, and cannot happen without all of those folks working together. And so just some myth busting around what happens and how it happens, and also the idea that a hormone blocker is a irreversible change. It simply is not an irreversible change. It's like a pause button that then can be unpaused once a young person has made a decision about how they would like the next few years of their life to go, as well as the future that they are imagining with the support of their parents and practitioner. But yes, as you can see, gender affirming care is so many things, and is not something that should be gatekept from young people, because so much of it are things that are rooted in exploration that is super developmentally appropriate for young people, like figuring out how they want to express their identity through clothing, through haircuts, through maybe nicknames or names. Like these are all really important parts of self-discovery that young people should have access to. And again, not everyone wants to access anything physical, but there are, of course, non-medical elements of the physical that also should be available to young people, which are gender-affirming gear and items. Um, and I think that that is a really important part of discovery and understanding as well. So in conversations around gender affirming care, we are always in a conversation around realities of pathology um, and working to de-pathologize the ways that trans people are talked about. And so in order, I think, to understand where we are now, we have to understand some of our immediate histories. I'll just move this over so folks can see. And so over here we have Eli Clare, who is an incredible thinker, writer, academic, um, creative. And Eli talks about a lot of elements about the pathology around transness and the ways that then trans people talk about their bodies through that context of pathology. So Eli Clare says, I often hear trans people, most frequently folks who are using or wanting to use medical technology to reshape their bodies, to name their transness as a birth defect. And so, of course, this also talks about the intersection of ableism here in relationship to transphobia and the pathology of transphobia. So in our histories, we have to also acknowledge that it was only within our recent histories that homosexuality was removed from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM, and until 79 was still um, a way to force people into institutionalization. So that's a really recent history. And that's not even speaking about gender, that's just speaking about sexuality. Gender dysphoria is now listed in the DSM as a way to diagnose. The way I feel about that is a whole other workshop, but there are some important pieces, while they are complex and difficult, about having a diagnostic model for gender dysphoria. So there is, of course, a necessity for medical support through that process, usually. And in the past, you can see in brackets what it used to be called in the DSM. And when we have something that is diagnosable, even if the implication is not meant to pathologize, it still creates pathology, right? And it still becomes something that people, even if they really don't mean to, associate with a mental disorder or illness, because it is in the DSM a diagnosable. Um, Reality within the DSM. So I think while, again, there's a lot of complexity to unpack here, it's important to know these histories and know the realities that currently exist, which have led to a place where we see a lot of the, I think, amazing historical strides that we've taken be walked back to a place where we're seeing a lot of anti-trans and anti-queer rhetoric and legislation across the country and south of the border. And again, if we go even further back, this is a 1920s eugenics society poster that says, "Live, love, and marry wisely. The result is sound children." And of course, here we see rhetoric that it's necessary for marriage to result in children. And of course, this context of marrying wisely is really imbued with classism, racism, ableism, right? And so I think that there is a lot of foundations to the ways that we understand our cultural norms that are actually really embedded in um, in pathology, in homophobia and racism and ableism and transphobia, and of course the ways that power are used for and against people based on their identities. And there is a long history, of course, of societal framing of gender and sexual variance as a form of disability or as something that is criminalized, right? And so, with these relatively recent contexts in history, it makes sense that we start to see things like legislation pop up that feels so archaic, but actually isn't that far away from the context that we have now. And in this conversation, of course, as the Youth Project, we want to center young people because young people are often neglected in larger conversations around advocacy and rights, and often don't have a lot of their own autonomy in relationship to state-made decisions, national decisions, legislation, right? And taking us a little bit back in our history as well, thinking about Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson, two incredible activists and advocates within the trans community, who actually opened the first LGBT youth center in North America shortly after the Stonewall riots. And the reason why that youth center was created was because Marsha and Sylvia saw the needs of youth being neglected by a larger gay movement, and then, of course, by society at large. And so, really thinking about the histories of queer and trans youth activism really coming from a place of needing to fight for young people's voice and rights. And we're finding ourselves back in a position where we're looking to these incredible activists and advocates to show us the way forward because we are back in a place where young people are having to claw for their rights and for their voices to be heard on a national scale. So when we think about building safety for young people, for two-spirit trans and gender nonconforming folks, I want to give a framework that I find supportive and helpful. And I'm going to go through this framework, and then we're going to talk a little bit about anti-trans legislation that we're seeing across the country. The perceive and feel framework is a way to think about offering care and support, perceiving something, so the space, whether it's an actual physical space or the feeling of how a program feels or an office feels, right? The space looks like it is inclusive and supportive of marginalized groups of people. Marginalized groups and people feel safe and supported in the space. So that's kind of the difference between the perceiving and the feeling, but both are actually quite important to creating, I think, equitable and safer spaces. Some questions I like to ask. Who is represented in the space? Who isn't and why? What barriers currently exist and how are they navigated? What are some small tasks and commitments that you or your workplace or the space that you are engaging in can easily make to create more supportive, accessible, kind spaces? And what tasks require higher levels of engagement and consultation to create a space where people perceive and also feel safe? Some examples of a perceive framework are symbols and imagery, representation within staff, something like as small as including your pronouns on a name tag or in email signature. If you are a place that has intake forms or you're working with clientele, really thinking about the language that's on those intake forms. Gender neutral spaces like washrooms or amenities. Um, and again, I think with the context and conversation around gender neutral spaces, not every washroom needs to be a gender neutral washroom, but there should be a gender neutral washroom in an easily accessible way or place where and close to you are gathering or meeting. Because of course, gender neutral washrooms like don't also work for everyone, right? And so part of the conversation around creating and building safety and inclusion is thinking about an intersectional context and thinking about how many needs can I meet um, through this decision. And then if I'm not meeting everyone's needs, who else can I consider? And how else can I consider those realities? And then, of course, publicly available inclusion policies or procedures. So that could be available on a website. It could be available on on like a social media platform. Um, and I think signaling to the greater public, hey, we are interested in these conversations, creates that feeling of, oh, I perceive that this place is actually starting this conversation or far along in this conversation, and I might feel more at home or interested in engaging with their space or services. And this is the feel framework, and this is taking the ways in which we are starting the conversation through the perceive framework and really centering it in the ways that we operate. So, important dates, honoring important dates for the 2S LGBTQIA plus community, actually having inclusive and engaged programming and services that actually support um, two-spirit, trans, and gender nonconforming people and populations, um, using inclusive language, using people's correct pronouns, creating an actual supportive environment, not just through visuals like flags or pamphlets, but actually creating a space where staff might feel safe to come out, that there is gender affirming care on health plans, right? Things like this that allow for people to feel truly like I am supported. And of course, consultation and partnership. So, who's at the table? And if they're not at the table, how do we bring them and compensate them for being at the table? And a big part of this field framework, I think, in youth work is how do we get young people's voices at the center and how do we compensate them for their brilliance in conversation around identity that they really are leading? And I want to align myself with youth because through history, we've seen youth at the forefront of many different social justice movements and really leading the change that I believe we all deserve. And youth are able to do this beautiful thing, which is imagine a new world. Um, and that's why I really want to center young people's voice in this crucial conversation. So this is a map that was created by trans advocate Celeste Trianon, who currently lives in Montreal. And this image was last updated in July 2025. And it's a project that Celeste has, which is mapping different legislative risks across the country to the best of her ability. Um, and this project is quite comprehensive. And so, if you're interested in learning more about how she makes these maps and what she's looking for, you can visit her website. But really, what it's demonstrating is where we see highest risk of anti-trans legislation, where we see moderate risk, and where we see current bills in legislature, laws that are active, and the use of the notwithstanding clause in some of this lawmaking. And I'm going to talk about the notwithstanding clause a little bit because it's actually a huge part of the conversation in anti-trans legislation. Um, but this is, showing where we're at. I think some things have changed. We just had some legislation drop in Alberta, so I think Alberta is using the notwithstanding clause, so this would look a little bit different. But you can see that Nova Scotia is at a moderate risk. And when talking to Celeste about that, um, and asking a little bit about the way that moderate risk is assessed, it's in places that don't have any proactive policy and are close to or have engaged in legislation that is similar to the provinces that we see enacting some pretty intensive anti-trans legislation, as well as thinking about the current government, of course, in those provinces. So when Alberta dropped some very recent anti-trans legislation, we created a resource as an organization for youth to talk about what it meant and why. And this resource was so needed that on social media it reached over 34,000 people. And we saw young people really engaging because they finally were able to share with us, wow, I actually understand what's happening and I don't feel so helpless. Um, and I now understand this like really big thing um, in a way that I can explain to my parents, to my teachers, to my friends and can actually verbalize and talk about how this makes me feel, which is another really important part of the situation that we're in, because youth mental health is also a key part of this conversation. If young two-spirit, trans, and gender nonconforming youth don't feel a sense of belonging, don't feel a sense of safety, they are at high risk, right, for so many things, including negative mental health. And so, as a reduction of harm for young people's mental health, I think it's really important that provincially we show those young people that we are invested in their futures, that we are happy to support them in the ways that they want to become who they are, and that we give them space to really explore who they are through the context of freedom of expression, right? So this, I'll kind of go through what happened in Alberta, but this resource is available on our social media as well as through our link tree. And so there is a plain text version as well that goes over all of these pieces in a little bit more detail without all of the illustrations. If you are more of a person who likes to read, yeah, kind of just like uh, the information instead of engaging with drawings. Um, so In November, Alberta used the notwithstanding clause to override the charter of rights of override, sorry, the charter rights of two-spirit and trans communities. And so the notwithstanding clause is something that is used that usually actually hasn't been used in our in recent political conversation because it has been seen as something that is the antithesis to democracy because it is almost like a loophole. And so when the charter was passed in 1982, some premiers asked for an actual loophole, and this became the notwithstanding clause. And they felt like the charter would take away too much of their power. And this loophole became seen as a notwithstanding clause, S33 of the charter. And this allows governments to pass law or introduce law that likely violate fundamental rights and freedoms in the Charter, and actually prevents courts from having the ability to strike them down. Because usually, if you introduce a law that is in violation of the freedoms and rights within the Charter, um, the court has the ability to say, no, thank you. But if you use this loophole, uh, it is impossible within the way that it's currently written for a court to strike down that bill. So the loophole, this notwithstanding clause, can be used federally. It's never been used federally, and but it has been used provincially. Um, the courts can eventually argue that a law is unconstitutional, but only after 5 years have passed. So the notwithstanding clause has a 5 year term, if that makes sense. Um, there also is no limit to how many times a law that uses the notwithstanding clause can be reenacted. So, for example, if a law is put forward that uses the notwithstanding clause, and then its 5 year term happens, it can be reenacted if the same government is in place or if a government or person in position of power who feels similar ideals is in a position of power. And so some very fundamental rights are at risk. And here are some examples of this: freedom of conscience and religion, freedom of thought, belief, and expression, peaceful assembly and association, rights upon arrest or detention, right to an interpreter at legal proceedings, right? These are all really important elements of our rights and freedoms. And the notwithstanding clause applies to Section 2 and Sections 7 to 15. And we think these rights are really important. And I think education about what the notwithstanding clause can attack is an important part of the conversation around the push for anti-trans legislation. Because once we start to push back and claw back at rights for one, we know historically that we see that happening and replicating in different ways to target other marginalized populations. So really, I've heard people talk about how the notwithstanding clause used to be seen as kind of the bad apple of politics that no one wanted to touch because it often ended in a lot of backlash. But in recent years, governments have been feeling a little bit more comfortable using the clause as a free pass to override charter rights. So I'm going to focus a little bit on what's happening in Alberta specifically. So in December 2024, exactly a year ago, Alberta passed three laws targeting gender diverse youth and trans women. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what these laws are in a moment. But what we saw was some really brilliant advocacy that was youth led. Five gender diverse youth took legal action against Alberta, arguing that the law violated the rights of gender diverse youth. And then in June, so just this past June, the court granted an injunction preventing these bills, especially Bill 26, from coming into effect. And the court ruled that this law would cause irreparable harm to trans youth. So this just happened. The court said, no, this can't happen. These young advocates and activists are absolutely correct. It's really important that these laws don't pass, especially Bill 26. And so just to kind of go over what the bills were, Bill 26 banned health professionals from providing various gender-affirming healthcare to youth under the age of 18. And so, as we talked about, gender affirming healthcare can be so many things. And so, this is obviously a bill rooted in a lot of misinformation. Also, provincially, most contexts of gender affirming care can't be accessed until you are 18 anyway. But there are, of course, some elements like hormone blockers that are really important for young people to use to be able to make decisions, informed decisions about what they want to do next with their bodies. But also, of course, gender affirming care can be anything from supporting a young person in accessing proper name change documents, proper legal contexts of transition, supporting young people in socially transition and getting the mental health support that they need to do that within their schools and school networks, right? Gender affirming care is such a blanket context and statement. Um, Bill 27, which requires youth to have parental permission for classroom changes, name changes, and pronoun changes. So youth have to have their parents like sign off or guardians sign off if they want to use a new name at school or a new pronoun at school. And this, of course, is really, really difficult because some youth um, come from very unsupportive homes and don't have parents or guardians that would allow for them to use a different name or pronoun at school. And what we've seen provincially is youth really needing their classroom to be a safe space for them because it's like the oasis they have in between a really difficult home life and after school experience. This also restricts education on gender identity and sexual orientation, um, even though I think our curriculums are still quite behind nationally. We've seen some important strides in conversations about identity, um, bodily autonomy, consent, and all of these conversations center around being able to understand who we are better and give young people the tools in self-expression and identification, which are important ways for young people to learn how to understand themselves better and express themselves better and relate to each other better across difference. And of course, we understand that this curriculum isn't meant to make anyone trans or queer, but rather create more supportive classrooms where students who are trans and queer feel like they can be themselves in a reality of safety and support. And Bill 29, which bans trans women and trans feminine and gender diverse individuals from participating in competitive sports. And this is for trans youth and adults, which is a really wild bill. So, after ruling that Bill 26 would cause irreparable harm, on November 18th, 2025, Alberta repackaged these three bills, 26, 27, and 29, into one bill, Bill 9. And we believe that this is intentionally overriding charter rights of gender diverse people and going to create a lot of harm for young people in the province of Alberta, but also throughout the rest of Canada. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that I need to share about this. Oh, and the notwithstanding clause was used to introduce Bill 9. And so there's a brief history of taking action around the notwithstanding clause. So what we've seen is because the courts don't have any real say in the use of a notwithstanding clause, the most powerful tool is people speaking out in outrage against the use of this clause. So in 2022, Ontario used the clause for back to work legislation. and people pushed back. The public backlash was very significant. Workers organized a general strike, leading the government to repeal the law only after 11 days. And in 1998, the Alberta government again tried to pass a bill limiting compensation for victims forcibly sterilized by the government, and the bill was withdrawn after public outcry. Alberta also tried to use a clause in the 2000s to prohibit same-sex marriage. But that law was struck down because of public outrage, but also because the federal government can only make rules about marriage. So there are a lot of different ways to take action. We've seen some really important action already spring up around this, specifically within the context of Alberta. So you'll see here we have Queer Momentum, which is the Stop Smith campaign. Um, we have a whole bunch of other really amazing petitions, like from Transaction Alberta, as well as from the CCLA. And we also see Bill 50 introduced in Manitoba, which announces that the current government in Manitoba will never use the notwithstanding clause and kind of created a new bill, Bill 50, to require um, any kind of future possibility of the clause to automatically refer to the Manitoba Court of Appeal for an opinion on whether the law violates charter rights. So, of course, that's a really exciting and important bill. Of course, bills can change based on who is in elected power, but it is a really great way to take a stance and say to the province, we see what's happening in Alberta. We don't want people to feel afraid that their charter rights are on the line. We are taking a stance as a province against that possibility. Of course, other ways that we can have and take action are by having this conversation and finding ways to make this information accessible to all. This is a really great kind of exercise and resource that I wanted to share with you quickly, created by the Bay Area Transformation Justice Collective and by one of my favorite activists and advocates, Mia Mingus. Um, and this is called pod mapping, and it's an exercise to create social change in our communities. And so it's used as a way to get messages out and mobilize groups of people. So, for example, you can put yourself in the middle, or you can put a social issue that you're wanting to have conversations around in mobilizing. So, for example, we put the use of the notwithstanding clause in the middle. That's like the center goal. And then we create pods based up of 3 to 10 people that help with various parts of that. So maybe one member of your pod is the like community conversation pod. So these people are tasked with talking to their community members about what the notwithstanding clause is and why it matters. Then maybe this pod is the public lobbying and advocacy pod, and they're working with organizations provincially and nationally and finding ways that the community can be involved in pushing their governments for change and proactive and supportive and protective policies. Maybe one pod uh, is specifically the activist pod, and it's people who want to do public demonstrations to gain public consciousness and awareness about what's going on. Maybe there's the Brilliant Legal Brains Pod, and this is a group of allied organizations or community members who want to take these big topics and find ways to create plain text resources so that the average person who isn't trained within legal understandings can understand what's happening in their province and across the country. So these are some examples of pods. Then these kind of like less um, bolded line pods are groups of people that you want to bring into the work and build further relationships with. So this could be like someone that you know who's doing really cool design work, or someone that you know who has done some really great historical legislation change or advocacy, and you want to talk to them and get their perspectives, right? These are people that you want to build relationships with to make your pod stronger. And then these big circles are resources that you can call on. Maybe they're digital resources, maybe they're like literal archives. Maybe they are really big national organizations that are doing lobbying and legislation work or narrative change work, and you want their perspectives. But these are kind of like bigger systemic supports that we can call on. This is a really simple way to think about how we can mobilize with the resources and skills we have to create lasting change in our communities. If this seems exciting or interesting to you, I really recommend that you Google the Bay Area Transformation Justice Collective and see the kind of work that they have done to create change within their communities and within the Bay Area at large. I want to close today by talking about youth voice. And this is a conversation that two youth, 16 and 17, had with our organization about gender euphoria. And gender euphoria is kind of like the opposite of dysphoria, the joy that comes from experiencing your gender and identity in a way that is right to you. So one youth says, I wish we talked about gender euphoria more. Chasing that is what helped me ground myself in my body. It's what let me get to know myself through my own eyes rather than society's. That euphoria is what connects us and lets us know we can and will find ways to be at home with ourselves. So beautiful, beautiful words. And then another youth says, realizing my trans identity meant taking control of how I present myself. Although that didn't manifest positively all the time, I would rather focus on the euphoria of my trans experience. So often, only the negative aspects of being trans are highlighted, but what about our joy? I've experienced so many genuine moments of euphoria, from changing my name to finally dressing in a way that matches how I feel, that encompasses me better than my sorrow. It is essential to recognize and celebrate trans joy in order to progress in any way. Part of the narrative change is also ensuring that youth voice is at the center because that is such a beautiful and clear message. A lot of the misinformation talks about how young people don't understand themselves and don't know who they could be or who they couldn't be. And I think when we have young people's voices at the center and where they are at the table, it is clear that they know what they need and it's clear that they know what's best for them and for their bodies. And it's up to us as folks who have more power and more access to supports, that we find ways to uplift that trans voice, that two-spirit voice, that gender nonconforming youth voice, and make sure that they have access to the things that they need, and the things that they need aren't taken away from them. Right now, we have a lot of really supportive elements of gender affirming care in our province, and so it's really important that that stays protected. These are just some ways that we can think about change making from these foundations of safety, transparency, collaboration, empowerment, and intersectionality. And I ask folks as we close out today, what are their personal and professional commitments for deepening anti-oppression, gender justice, professionally and personally? And as my favorite science fiction writer, Octavia Butler says, there is nothing new under the sun, but there are new suns. I'm going to stop sharing and just ask if folks have any questions.
Thanks, Carmel. You'll notice the chat is quiet. The chat wasn't enabled, but the Q&A is also quiet. Haven't had any questions submitted, which is probably for the best. We're at quite near time. We do have a few minutes though, if there were some questions folks wanted to drop in the chat just now, or rather in the Q&A just now. I just want to thank you so much for sharing that information and for the work that you're doing to ensure that this information gets into the hands of youth and folks who are supporting youth in community. I think it's important that we remain vigilant in Nova Scotia, given what's happening in other regions of the country. I think it's also very important to just reiterate that gender identity, gender expression, uh, sex are all protected characteristics under the Nova Scotia Human Rights Act, and that folks that feel as though they may have been discriminated against rather are encouraged to contact the Human Rights Commission. It's also important to make the distinction that any acts of violence, physical or otherwise, would be considered police matters, and folks should feel very compelled to seek out the support of law enforcement if things do tread into that area. Carmel, folks can learn more about the Youth Project at youthproject.ns.ca. Is that right? Yeah. And I just again want to thank you so much for being part of the discussion. This is the second session of the week that really amplified the notion of youth voices being central in the work that's being done in communities. And so grateful for you raising that and ending on that note again today. We'll wrap up now and just say that there's a several other sessions happening throughout Nova Scotia Human Rights Week, culminating on the 10th with the presentation of the Nova Scotia Human Rights Awards. And so folks can learn more about that and the events, ways to register at humanrights.novascotia.ca. We've got a session beginning at 1 o'clock on accommodations in the workplace. If folks have got some time and want to check that one out as well. The recording of this session will be made available via the Commission's website within 24 hours. So please do consider sharing this if you know of folks that meant to be here and were unable to, or others that may benefit from learning about the work of the Youth Project and the subject that's been discussed today. I'll leave the final word to you, Carmel, if there's anything you'd like to say.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Thank you so much, May. And thank you, everyone who attended. I've put my email in the chat, which is just my first name at youthproject.ns.ca. So please be in touch if you have any questions, if you want more information, if there's a young person in your life that you feel like could benefit from our services and resources. Please be in touch. And thank you for being committed to this important work as we navigate some big changes across the country.
Thanks so much, Carmel. Take care.